Welcome to Burgernomics, demystifying economics with Ross MacDowell.
Hi, I'm Ross MacDowell, and welcome to the Burgernomics podcast, where we demystify economics. My mother has just moved into aged care, and it's my task to sell the family home. That means I've got the dreaded task of disposing of the household contents that have provided comfort to my parents, my sister, and my brother, and a variety of cats and dogs for decades. Currently, I'm gazing at the oak French-polished dining room table that has heard countless family dinner arguments. According to my mother, who turns 100 in a couple of weeks, it is a priceless antique. Then, over in the corner, is my grandfather's retirement gift from his employer, the International Harvester Company, a grandfather clock, another antique, and, of course, according to my mother, worth thousands of dollars. And what about that prized Wedgwood dinner set, only brought out for special occasions? And lastly, of course, my mother and father's wedding presents. They all have to be disposed of so I can sell the family home. So sitting opposite me is Connor Slattery, an expert valuer and auctioneer who specialises in the disposal of household items, whether they are people just downsizing, a deceased estate, or when it's time to ship mum off to aged care. Connor, welcome to the Burgernomics podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Connor, your job is to walk through someone's home and assign a dollar value to a lifetime of their possessions based on what you know they will sell for at auction. And we're talking about their jewellery, cutlery, furniture, rugs, electrical appliances, and I guess the list is endless. Tell me how all that works.
Essentially, I come into the house. We will generally go through room by room. We'll look at each item that is not to be kept. The items that people want to retain obviously don't need to be valued unless there's a contest to the will, if it's a deceased estate. And then I let them know which items will be saleable through auction, which items won't, and then the saleable items, I give them a range that we expect to find a hammer fall for. The range is typically within sort of 10% either way, about 80% of the time. You do get outliers. It's a bit like a cricket team. You're going to have a couple of people hit a century, a couple of people go out for a duck, but on average, you will hit in that range for the entire contents.
Okay, and you walk through with an iPad, list everything down, itemize it, and then send it to the people or discuss it with them. Probably they'd be asking you questions as you're walking through. Tell me some of the reactions to the valuations that you're putting on their furniture you get from them.
It depends the type of furniture, but most typically with antique, particularly Victorian, it's called brown furniture, being oak or mahogany, it tends to be a bit of shock. The traditional wisdom was that you bought it, you paid a premium because of its age, its rarity, the value of the wood, and it would go up in price when you came to sell it 50 years later. That's really no longer the case. I've been in this general field for about a bit over 8 years now. And in that time, the values have gone down for that type of brown furniture, probably at least 50 to 60%.
That's a massive amount.
They'd already dropped well before that. So I would say 15 years ago is probably when it started to really drop down. And you're looking at maybe 10% of the value that things were selling for back then. Not everything has dropped, obviously, but particularly the English oak and mahogany has dropped. French has sort of held up a little bit better, but that's generally the state of it.
So we've got people that have used this furniture for a long period of time, seen it every day, reinforced in their mind how much they believe that it's worth, and then you give them the shock of their life. Tell me some of the reactions.
Some of it's disbelief. Some of it is there is sometimes a view that I'm not sure that I know what I'm talking about and that they need a second opinion, and they will go and often find a second opinion or fail to find a second opinion because the dealers that used to exist no longer do because their margins don't exist anymore. And we will hear back from them a couple of weeks later and they ask us to come in and deal with it all.
So they've bought at a high price many years ago an antique. They believe that it's only going to go up in value because if it was an antique then, it must be even more antique now. They've watched Antique Roadshow on TV. They've seen that every house is full of treasures. Surely this level of shock must be profound for them.
It is, and it's totally understandable. When you've bought something expecting it to be an appreciating asset and you find out that it very much isn't, you're entitled to feel a fair bit of shock. But the reason that their contents is worth a lot less now than it was 20 years ago is the same reason that their land is worth 20 times as much as it was 20 years ago. We're moving into smaller and smaller places. Very few places these days have room for a full dining table that is used just as a dining table. These days, most people have a dining table, which is also the kitchen table, which is also the table the kids do the homework on. You can't do that with a French polish.
Saying demand is really dropped out for antiques.
It has, because the people who want them already have them. They've either bought them themselves, they've inherited from their parents as their parents have passed away or downsized, or they're downsizing themselves. Their children don't want it. So I imagine your parents were of a generation where most of them got married at 25, bought a house, lived there for 50 years, and may have downsized right towards the end.
Correct.
That is no longer the case. In Melbourne, people are moving on average every 7 to 10 years. In some suburbs, particularly to the north and west, it's closer to 5 to 7 years. The cost of moving has gone up as the cost of labour has gone up. So the metric to the cost benefit of buying a $20,000 table that may not fit into where you're going to live in 5 years and may not suit where you're going to live in 5 years just doesn't add up.
So you're saying that maybe my parents' generation, the silent generation, the post-war generation, who invested in what they believed was good furniture, which provided a certain level of status for them in life, doesn't apply so much these days to younger generations that will buy far cheaper furniture, knowing that it's probably going to get thrown out every 5 or 7 years.
That's correct. Thrown out or sold, at a fraction of its purchase price, but still cheaper than paying for it to be moved. The other side of that, though, is that your parents' generation enjoyed this furniture for 30 years. That's the benefit of having hardwood furniture, but it's no longer going to be the case. There are very few people who would expect to still be using anything in their house aside from a few mementos 20 years from now.
One of the conflicts that immediately comes to my mind in this discussion is that you buy something, a piece of furniture, it's worth a certain amount of money, and you get a degree of utility from it, great economic term, over a series of years, and you pay an insurance premium in case something bad happens to it, and that is based upon its purchase price or the price that you want to assign to it. It would appear that that price is quite different in reality, and that many people are paying very big insurance premiums on furniture that's value doesn't represent that insurance policy. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. Part of doing valuations is also working out whether they need the client needs an insurance valuation or a market valuation. So the market valuation is what it's likely to sell for at auction. The insurance valuation is what you're going to pay full retail from a dealer, which tends to be 3 to 10 times as much as the market value. It's really the difference between wholesale and retail.
So replacement cost, you're really...
Precisely, to go out today to pick it up. So if I went to Graham Geddes to go and get...
Which is a renowned antique
dealer. Yes. Who is a renowned antique dealer.
Yes.
And one of the few still standing in Melbourne.
Yeah.
He's down in High Street, and it used to be something of a mecca for antique dealers. I grew up down there, and there would have been 20 within walking distance from my home. These days, there's 1 or 2.
And that's just because the antique market has absolutely had the bottom drop out of it.
It's absolutely collapsed. When I started, 8 years ago, there was still probably a majority of the purchases through auctions across the board. All the different auction houses were still dealers. These days, that is no longer the case at all. So in some ways that has softened the drop in value because it's no longer the majority of buyers buying at that sort of 10 to 30% of what they expect to be able to sell it for, but that hasn't stopped the drop.
So if I look at, for example, classic cars, only a certain number of these cars, classic cars, were made, and they have continuously gone up in price. Now, for example, let's take a classic Porsche. I'm not particularly enamoured with Porsches, don't really interest me. They do some people, but the price has gone up and up and up and up. Antique furniture, there's a limited number made. They get older, but they're not going up and up and up. There's only a very select number of people that want to buy classic cars, and so you wouldn't say it's a huge market. Same situation for antiques. There's not a lot of people that want antiques, but they've both gone in different directions. Now, you're putting that down solely to the size of living spaces or to consumer tastes that people don't want maybe what their parents wanted?
A bit of both. A car will suit a garage typically regardless of the style, whereas furniture won't suit a house. But also, most people buy cars at a premium for brand value. Porsches are sold to Porsche collectors. Ferraris tend to be bought by Ferrari owners.
You're saying that with a smile on your face. Have you got something against Ferrari owners?
No, not at all. Great cars, but you're paying a premium for a brand. Because also most Porsche owners aren't driving their car at its limit. They're driving it around town. They're not getting above 60 kilometres an hour. They're not even hitting 60 kilometres an hour very often. I knew a guy who actually worked at a Porsche dealer, and they would have people bring in their cars and say, "Oh, it's not running right. Can you fix it?" And most of the time, the fix was taking it down to a racetrack and burning it around a few times because they get carbon buildup in the engine because it was all driven around, in third gear at 800 revs. It's not what the car's made for. So people are buying it because they want to have a Porsche rather than they want to be able to drive at 200 kilometres an hour day in, day out.
So it's a branding exercise for their own personality. Is that the same with antiques though? Don't you, for example, I can remember previous Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating, who enjoyed French clocks.
Yeah.
He would know all the details and enjoyed that branding exercise. Does that not apply to antiques?
It does to a point, and with clocks specifically, because you do have known makers, there is a premium on clocks where what would be an analogous piece of furniture or doesn't have the same value that you can get from clocks from a known and sought after maker. So there are a number of things that go into the value of an item. The main one is obviously how popular it is, then rarity, utility, and the more detail you can get about an item and present with an item, the greater the value tends to be because you're able to attract those people who are interested in that specific thing. I cleared a deceased estate for the National Trust out in Malden a number of years ago, where the gentleman had left his entire home to the National Trust, expecting them to turn it into a little museum. It was all decked out in Victorian-era furniture, but Victorian-era stuff is a lot of different things. It wasn't a particularly coherent collection. There was borer through a lot of it. Most of it had a small bit of damage, but none of it was pristine. They took a couple of clothes mangles and said, "Can you please deal with the rest?" The contents of the house was worth a few $1,000s. The contents of the tool shed was worth somewhere between 10 and 15,000 from memory. The tools were worth a lot. There were some old kerosene tins that were worth a couple of $1,000s. There was a 1960s phone directory which sold for $50, which isn't a great deal, but it means that at least two people bid on it, which means there are at least two people who collect phone books, which is slightly terrifying. But those items that can fit into a collection where it's going to be missing for a lot of people because it's a rare item. I think it was Kookaburra brand kerosene, which was only produced for 3 or 4 years in the 60s. It's missing in a lot of people's collections, so that's why it was worth a great deal. Whereas the majority of kerosene tins aren't worth much, but, those ones that are the whole in the collection are worth a great deal. And it's the same with Porsches. It's the same with anything. With Rolexes as well, it's the granulation of the description adds the value. If it's this specific type with this specific serial number on it, this is where you get.
So it's demand. I mean, it's like, for example, antique number plates.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Their utility is no different to a normal registration plate.
No.
Other than their rarity, and the value of those have gone through the absolute roof.
Yeah.
So we've got houses full of furniture that isn't worth nearly as much as their occupants believe that the furniture is worth. Traditionally, then altruism kicks in and they go, let's send this to charity. Let's send this to St. Vincent de Paul, Salvation Army. They've got shops everywhere. Let another family enjoy this, and it makes me feel good because I'm giving it to this charity. But that's not happening either now, is it? The charities don't want furniture.
A lot less than they used to. Part of it is the business practice for those op shops has sort of shifted, where they used to provide, cheap goods to people who couldn't afford to pay much. The focus is now more raising funds to fund, or raising money to fund their other works.
So they're a cash flow model for the rest of their business. It's not like the old op shops where you'd walk in and there would be someone's grandmother working as a volunteer, so grateful that you brought anything for them to sell at a fraction of the cost.
Yep.
And that money would then be used to assist people that are poor.
Yep.
Now we've got these almost superstores that have to make margins.
Yeah.
So they're no different now than a normal furniture shop.
Except that I suppose the funds go to in theory charitable works as opposed to shareholders, but more or less. There is still a part of that cheap resource for people, but it's less so. There are, though, charities that do accept goods to give direct material donations to people in need, who will take even things like mattresses, bedding, Tupperware, because they're helping people deck out an entire house if they're coming from a family violence situation or immigration detention, something like that. Typically, they're accessed via the end user's social work agency. There are a number of Rotary-run charities called the Emergency Relief Network. There's the Eastern, Western and Melbourne and Inner Melbourne. There's also the Western Welcome Wagon, which I think is in Footscray, out that direction somewhere. And then in Airport West, there's Helping Hands. And then there are a couple more out in Geelong as well.
So they're fulfilling what we regarded as what the Salvation Army and the St. Vincent de Paul used to do. These people now will accept goods. Are they selective also?
It depends which one. The Eastern is the most selective just because they sort of service a very large area and it tends to be more affluent. So there's better stock for them to choose from. The Western and Inner Melbourne tend to be less picky, but that being said, there are still limits on things that they'll take. They won't take king-size beds or king singles because they're too large. Large furniture, which won't fit into the type of housing that their clients are likely to be living in, won't be taken. And obviously, if there's any sort of significant damage, it's not going to be of any use to anyone.
So do they ask you to bring the items to their warehouses at your cost, or do they come and pick it up?
A bit of both. It depends on the time frame, though. So last I spoke to, Warren, the Western Emergency Relief Network, I think it was about a 4 to 6 week sort of lag time. That being said, that was a fairly long time ago. You can drop stuff off by arrangement, but they have varying operating times, so you need to sort of organise that.
So we look at these very few charities compared to the network charities of the Salvation Army, etc., that are fulfilling this new role. What about migration and these new charities? Is there a link there? I mean, we've gone from 130,000 migrants to Australia coming in to 300,000. It may expand even more per year. Surely these migrants might be in a situation where they need furniture and there is a market for getting rid of household items. Is that working?
The issue is cost. It's the same with anything. We produce more food than we need a number of times over in a global sense, but there are still famines because the matter of logistics is hard to overcome. It's the same sort of thing with dealing with secondhand furniture. If it costs nothing to get things to people, then that would not be an issue. But if you're faced with paying a removalist a couple of $100 to take a mattress to a charity because it's going to take them an hour to get out to whoever will be able to accept it at that time, drop it off and then come back, everyone's better off if you just donate that $200 or $400 to the charity. That all being said, the rise of online marketplaces, both paid and unpaid, has filled an awful lot of gaps. So where people used to bring in items either for donation or for sale, and they might sell for $200 for a sofa that's in reasonable condition and not floral, because most of the charities won't take anything floral anymore.
Why not floral?
It's not in vogue. They can't shift it. If you've got a choice between a floral sofa that is hard to match with the rest of your decor and isn't particularly fashionable, and one that is a plain sofa, you're going to pick the plain one.
So society has got to such a level now that if you don't have the finances to go and buy new furniture and you have to go to secondhand shops, charities or whatever, people are still picky about, no, I don't like that. Rather, they're not worried about the utility, they're worried about what it looks like.
Because the cost of getting rid of a sofa is not insignificant unless you happen to have a hard rubbish collection coming up. People list them online for free to pick up and you have a great deal of choice. So in some ways it's very good. It's filled the gap that the charities aren't able to fill, whether it's because of focus or because of capacity, but it has dropped down the value of that lower end of the market, which is sort of expanded out really throughout the secondary furniture market. The bottom things have dropped down. A $200 sofa is now, you can get it for free. So the $400 sofa is now, $100 to $200. The $1,000 sofa is still sort of, $600 to $800. And then the $10,000 sofa tends to still be worth $10,000 because the number of people who were going to pay that much for a secondhand sofa are still willing to pay that.
So I go off and buy a sofa for, let's say, $1,000, $2,000, whatever it costs. And I bring it home, I don't sit on it, and I immediately advertise it or ring you up and say, here we go, I've got this brand new sofa. It's still got the packaging. What's it worth?
Typically 10 to 30%. If it's a particularly sought after brand, it can be worth a little bit more, but that's generally about where it sits.
How do we explain a 70% drop in value of an item in the space of a day?
Finding the acquisition of sale costs a lot. So if I'm looking for a sofa, I go to a sofa store. I don't dig around to find one online or to go through the auction rooms and wait 2-3 months until one that I want turns up. Go somewhere where I can choose from 5,000 sofas.
So it's convenience. What we're talking.
It's convenience.
Yeah.
And then also just most people don't think to look for a sofa at an auction house. The impression that most people have is that it's mainly focused on antiques. So if I want a new sofa, I tend to. It's not something that comes into most people's mind. It's part of what I ask a lot of people when they balk at the values that I suggest to them. Is, well, how hard did you look for a secondhand sofa when you bought this? And say, well, I didn't. Of course not. And that's a fairly common attitude. So part of that is marketing, although we have made some significant inroads in that, and that's where we are seeing a bit of a bump in some types of furniture. But typically, it's just not the first thing that comes to mind when people are looking for a sofa.
So really, it's a function of people's time.
Absolutely. It's time and effort.
And we can quantify that in terms of a cost.
Yep.
And that's what you could do with your 70%. You could say, how much time is it going to take me to run around and look at this? And then what do I think my hourly rate is? And
precisely. And where a sofa used to cost, the equivalent of several $1,000s, now you can buy one for under $1,000 because it's being made overseas, it's being shipped over, and we're not adequately costing the carbon embedded in that. So let's talk about that carbon, because I know that that's a thing of interest to you. In terms of the supply chain, where do you believe we're headed with the manufacture of all of these household goods that you resell at a fraction of their purchase price
in the future, carbon credits, renewable energy, what government are doing in terms of restricting supply in certain areas, is that going to push the price of secondhand furniture up?
I think so, because I think that at some stage shipping is going to have to be, well, the carbon cost of shipping is going to have to be priced. Most people see the ships coming in and out of Port Melbourne and it doesn't look that bad. But that's because they have two different types of fuel. There's the fuel that they use in port, and then there's the fuel that they use once they're in the open seas, which is typically still just briquettes. Like it's, essentially burning coal. And it's this horribly thick black smoke. And occasionally, I live in St Kilda, so you see them coming in and out. And occasionally they will forget to switch over, and the difference is marked. It's quite insane.
And you believe that is going to be reflected in the increased cost of imported furniture?
I think there'll have to be, because to address that pollution is going to cost increasingly more and is going to be increasingly necessary. So that
will push up the price of furniture, and therefore the price of your valuations will go up?
I think so. It all depends on how long it takes. I think that if secondary market goods start getting carbon credits, essentially, that will invigorate a number of large tech firms to really invest in online sales platforms so that they can use those as offsets, which I think will sort of help people focus on buying something secondhand more.
Well, as a society, we are encouraged and have been for many, many years now about recycling. Yet that doesn't seem to be reflected in your industry.
No, because people think of recycling as a day-to-day, weekly exercise, whereas buying a sofa is something that you do, these days, maybe every 5 years. So
you're saying that the social conscience of recycling doesn't extend to anything beyond what we're fed as the media to just be recycling with the triangle and number 4 in it, that we've got antique furniture, we've got couches that have the same utility, we've got TVs that have the same image, we've got clocks that tell the same time, but as a society, we just want to pick and choose what we recycle, even though it's all as relevant, both to the environment and to the value.
I think that is a large part of it. The other part of it is the cost, both in time and money, in recycling large pieces of furniture. If it's going to take me 3 weeks to sell my sofa, which will eventually go for $50, and I've got to have half a dozen strangers come through my house, you'll get people who agree to pay $100, turn up, at the arranged time, say, well, I've only got $50 on me, take it or leave it. You deal with that a few times, it very quickly becomes boring. And all of a sudden, for $100, I'm not going to bother with that. I'm going to put it out. I'll put a, free to a good home sticker on it and hope that someone picks it up before I get a fine.
Off the nature strip.
Exactly.
So you're saying people's social conscience really only goes so far.
Absolutely.
It only presents itself for what is palatable for dinner table conversation, that when we look at whole houses of contents, the concept of recycling doesn't extend to that yet. It only extends to the soft plastics we're buying in the supermarket or whatever is fashionably talking about. It doesn't extend to, for example, the oak dining room table that sits over there that looks great, has serviced my family for a long, long time, and is going to end up at the tip, but recycling doesn't extend to that yet.
I think that part of that is also it's not something that we think about. The embedded carbon in, say, a leather sofa isn't, like, we don't think of that in terms of, well, it's the same as driving a car 2,000 or 10,000 kilometres.
Because it's not as obvious.
It's not as obvious, and it's not something that we're taught to think about in those terms.
Yeah.
But leather, I mean, the embedded cost in a square metre of leather is widely disputed depending on which side of the fence you're on. And it also depends on whether you consider leather to be a byproduct of the beef and dairy industry or a co-product. But so the range of estimates sort of go anywhere from 15 kilograms of CO2 to 170, depending on where you're looking.
Do you think that will eventually affect your business? That will come in sooner rather than later?
I think that once embedded carbon is given a price, then yes.
It will. Yeah. The mortgage cliff. Apparently we're about to all fall off the mortgage cliff. Do you think that, and it's meant to happen later this year, do you think that will affect your business, that will be a whole range of people that won't be able to afford going out and buying new furniture, and they will value their time at a very small amount because they have no money left, and all of a sudden second-hand prices will go up?
To a degree, but an awful lot of those people are also going to be downsizing. So they'll be offloading furniture. I think that the cliff may be a little overstated. Australians just historically have pretty much done everything to prevent losing the home. Some people, unfortunately, that is not going to be an option. It's inevitable that they have overextended, and given the expectation that interest rates wouldn't go up fairly or not, I think it is a really hard pill to swallow. But yeah, but I think that the market is already starting to normalise to the increase in interest rates. The biggest change, I think, has been that the outer suburbs is where you've seen the fall in prices, and then the inner suburbs, you've just seen a lack of stock coming onto the market. Where people can afford to hold off, they have, because you're not dealing with the deceased estate or moving in, or you have to move into aged care, for instance. People have held off selling the home, and we're starting to see an increase in prices again.
Okay.
I think by the end of the year, that's likely to be the case. The outer suburbs are still probably going to dip a bit, but you mentioned immigration before, where we don't suddenly have 300,000 new homes. So the quantity of stock hasn't increased significantly.
So you'd have to furnish the homes.
Yeah.
Put the pressure on. Talk to me about artificial intelligence taking over your job.
I think that my specific value is somewhat at risk in being able to give a degree of granulation to the description of items that I'm offering, being able to describe and to recognise the type of wood, whether it's we've got some burr walnut here and some oak, it looks like. That takes a degree of experience and expertise that I've already seen become less necessary, as you can stick your phone on it and, Google image search will give you sort of 1,000 options to choose from, but within the first 5, you're likely to find something that's very similar. You can read that description, and you can also typically find out, what that has sold for in the past. I think the value proposition from the auction house, though, is still strong in that you can deal with everything at once. Talking about interest rates as well, being able to clear a house in a week or two, as opposed to over the course of several months at 5% for $1 million is, spitting distance to $1,000 a week. It's 961. My maths is right.
Yep.
When you're talking about between sort of $2,000 and $20,000 worth of contents, the difference that you're going to lose in commissions and listing fees,
just because of the time factor of money,
is more than made up for by the fact that you're saving that $1,000 a week, or making that $1,000 a week if you're investing it.
So that's really what your whole business is. It's about time, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Well, everything's about time. It's about, you can do it yourself, but it's going to take you a whole lot of hours to do it. And however you value your time, you're not going to get an incremental increase in sale value to really justify that time.
Well, that's what you were paying the 300% to 1,000% markup at the antique dealers for, was the fact that they bought something and then had it in their shop for 5 years before someone came along to buy it. Unless you've got 5 years to wait for someone to spend $1,000 on your table, you're likely to be better off taking the $300.
You don't think there are people out there buying antiques at the moment for next to nothing and putting them in big warehouses thinking the market will eventually go up?
Oh, no, there definitely are. One of the dealers he used to have I think it was railway antiques. It was in one of it's now a light rail station, but tram station, but the train station along the Albert Park line.
Yep, the light rail.
Yeah, that used to be a train station.
Yeah.
He had a big warehouse out in the middle of Gippsland and was stockpiling all of his stock and then buying up other dealers' stock as they were sort of going under. And he was able to justify the costs by leasing it out to film and television production agencies. So they said, we've got a 1930s drama, we need a house full of 1930s furniture, and he was able to do that for them. I think that value proposition is diminishing. It's hard to maintain a French polish. It doesn't do well with sort of temperature fluctuations, any sort of moisture. It's a very delicate thing. I mean, it's part of the reason that the furniture is not worth much. It's just you can't look at it without damaging it. And the likelihood that people are going to suddenly have the space for a 12-seat dining table in the medium-term future is low.
Before we get to the Burgernomics test, which I'm going to be fascinated to hear how you're going to apply your business to the Burgernomics test, in summary, we can say that what happens now with the contents of households, because of the downsizing of space in new dwellings, things aren't worth nearly even close to what people imagine they are, and a lot of the contents are going to the tip. As a rough percentage, what do you think gets sold and what do you think goes to the tip?
It depends. I would say...
Is that suburb dependent? I mean, obviously it would be.
To an extent. The high-end stuff retains its value. The low-end stuff drops away. And then age, style, that all have... If you had a house that was decked out in 1992, everything there is not likely to be worth much.
It's going to the tip.
If it was all decked out in 1960s teak, then it's going to be worth a great deal.
Because that's what's wanted at the moment.
That's what has perennially been in vogue. Strangely, cane furniture has had a resurgence the last few years, which I didn't expect. But typically, so there are certain styles, even within Victorian era furniture. You've got Jacobean, which is the sort of very deep chairs and sofas with the often rattan siding. That has no value. It's really low. It's hard to get in and out of. And it's very, as I said, deep. So it takes up a lot of floor space. You can't give that away. But a nice Victorian settee, you might still get a couple of $100 for.
The Burgernomics test. So how would we apply the business of whether it's a deceased estate, whether it's downsizing, the disposal of the contents of a house via auction and via transport to the tip or transport to a charity? How do we apply that to the simple hamburger? Good luck.
I think it's about the quality of the hamburger that you're making. You can make an entirely serviceable hamburger on a $20 non-stick pan from Kmart that will absolutely satisfy you, but won't do much more than that, and will probably also pump you full of chemicals that you don't really want in your body. Or you could go to an auction house and buy what would be a retail, $200 cast iron skillet pan for the same $20 and make yourself a big, fat, juicy burger that, because it's nice, thick metal, you are able to get like a good crust on it without all the heat leaching out of the pan immediately, so it doesn't sort of stew itself, but still is nice and juicy on the inside, and enjoy it a great deal more, and also have that pan for 20 years, not be concerned about the chemicals in it leaching out into you, and have it for the rest of your life.
And be prepared to sell it for next to nothing or give it away or put it in the rubbish bin because you've had great utility from it.
Absolutely. And you've only spent $20 on it. And it's also good if, an intruder happens to come into the house and it needs a good whack across the head.
Connor Slattery, thank you very much for talking to us about what goes on in the valuation and the auction business. You may have depressed a few people. You may have enlightened a few people. But I think it's a fascinating reflection on society, that what you do, because you're bringing realism to something that really only happens once or twice in every family's life. So thanks for joining me.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Okay. My thanks to Connor Slattery, who demystified the economics of disposing
of the contents of family homes. Selling household items because we are downsizing, liquidating an estate, or placing a parent into aged care, we radically overvalue the possessions that need to be disposed of. Emotions get in the way before the reality of the law of supply and demand brutally kicks in. Because Australian households are downsizing, the supply of household items needing to be disposed of is increasing. Prices have dropped to clear the items. The price decline means many items become worthless. The local tip becomes the only way to dispose of them. Also, how you value your own time may determine your item's value. Are you willing to waste weeks or months of your precious time waiting for endless prospective buyers, or you could accept the lower valuation offered by an auction disposal service? Like all assets, your treasured family possessions are at the mercy of the law of supply and demand. And by the way, my mother Enid has successfully transitioned into aged care. She has celebrated her 100th birthday, receiving a congratulatory letter from King Charles. If you haven't already, please follow the Burgernomics podcast on your favourite podcast channel and put yourself on our website's email list so you never miss an episode.